This video is brought to you by my supporters on Patreon, Gcash, and Coffee. Stay tuned till the end of the video. On December 19, 2024, the Bangko Sentral ng Pilipinas, the Philippine Central Bank, unveiled a new series of banknotes called the First Philippine Polymer Series. While the bills retain many design elements from the new generation currency series, such as the colors and the outlines, one major change in the design sparked controversy. That is, historical figures were removed and replaced with endangered species native in the Philippines. This decision quickly drew backlash from historians, politicians, activists, and even the descendants of those featured on the previous banknotes.
Why remove? Why remove the heroes, diba? You can practice your numismatic artistry, We can celebrate our national wonders as part of our pride. Agree?
Kahit na mukha yan ng mga particular na tao, pero in general, mukha yan ng kabayanihang Pilipino. So parang tinanggalan mo ng pagpapalaga ang mga bayani natin.
Kasaysayan, ang pera ay isang way para magturo ng kasaysayan sa mga taong hindi napupunta sa paaralan. Maganda mag-promote ang ating biodiversity. Pero pwede naman na hindi tanggalin yung history.
Opposition groups saw this as an attempt by the Marcos administration to erase history, especially since the 500 peso bill shows the fierce political opponents of the Marcos family. Beyond familiar names like Rizal and the Aquinos, many Filipinos today don't recognize the other historical figures on their banknotes. So, who were these people, and what role did they play in shaping the Filipino nation? For more in-depth commentary and a list of sources used in this video, check out the link in the description below to listen to the podcast episode where I dive deeper into this topic. The Philippine Peso under the New Generation Currency Series includes 6 banknotes and 7 coins. According to the Bangko Sentral ng Pilipinas, each coin and banknote features historical figures based on their contributions to the country. In decreasing numerical order, the 1,000 peso bill features 3 prominent figures: Chief Justice Jose Abad Santos, Brigadier General Vicente Lim, and Josefa Yanez Escoda, symbolizing the government, military, and civil society. All 3 were martyrs who sacrificed their lives during the Second World War. The 500 and 200 peso bills features Senator Ninoy Aquino, his wife, President Cory Aquino, and President Diosdado Macapagal, renowned for their opposition to the dictator Ferdinand Marcos and his martial law regime. They played an important role in restoring democracy in the Philippines. The 100, 50, and 20 peso bills features Presidents Manuel Rojas, Sergio Osmeña, and Manuel Quezon, key figures in the struggle for Philippine independence during the American period and in the nation's post-war rebuilding. Lastly, the 10, 5, and 1 peso coins feature Apolinario Mabini, Andres Bonifacio, and Jose Rizal, figures that are pretty much known by most Filipinos as they are being taught in the Philippine educational curriculum. Jose Rizal was born in 1861 in Calamba, Laguna, in an era when Spain's grip on the Philippines was absolute, enforced by friars who controlled both the church and the government. As a young man, Rizal traveled to Europe to escape the injustice the government has wrought against his family. From there, he was exposed to liberal ideas, working with fellow reformists in Spain and fighting for the rights and freedoms of Filipinos. Through his writings, particularly the Non Limitangre and El Filibusterismo, Rizal exposed the abuses of the Spanish clergy and the injustices suffered by his fellow countrymen, as what they have done to the slain Gomburza priests, Fathers Mariano Gomez, Jose Burgos, and Jacinto Zamora. He advocated for peaceful reform, believing that education and intellectual progress were the keys to liberation. He was then exiled in Dapitan, and his works were soon banned by the colonial authorities. Among those who read his works was a man named Andres Bonifacio. Born into a modest family in 1863 in Manila, Bonifacio did not have the privilege of studying in European universities or writing for reformist circles. Instead, he educated himself, devouring books such as Rizal's works. In 1892, when Rizal founded the La Liga Filipina, a peaceful reformist group in the Philippines, Bonifacio was among its early members. But when the Spanish authorities arrested and exiled Rizal to Dapitan, Bonifacio realized that peaceful reform was futile. This led him to establish the Katipunan, a secret revolutionary society dedicated to independence against Spanish rule. Under his leadership, the Katipunan grew in number and spread in various towns and villages throughout the colony. In 1896, the Spanish authorities discovered its existence, forcing Bonifacio to launch an open revolt, starting the Philippine Revolution. Rizal was executed on December 30, 1896, falsely accused of inciting the revolution he never led. Despite his passion and leadership, Bonifacio's lack of formal military training and internal conflicts within the Katipunan led to his downfall. He was eventually executed by fellow Filipinos under President Emilio Aguinaldo's orders in 1897. But some leading figures of the revolution would soon oppose his execution, one of which is Aguinaldo's advisor, Apolinario Mabini. Mabini, born on July 23, 1864 in Tanawan, Batangas, was second from a family of 8 whose father was a peasant and mother a street vendor in the town market. Despite being paralyzed from polio, his intellect was sharp and became a respected lawyer and political thinker. Mabini initially shared Rizal's belief in peaceful reform, but when the revolution was in full swing, he became Emilio Aguinaldo's advisor, ensuring that they had a clear institutional framework. His intelligence and moral clarity earned him the title the brains of the revolution. Soon, the Philippines declared independence after more than 300 years of Spanish colonial rule, which was abrupted when the Spanish sold the Philippines to the Americans, starting the Philippine-American War. When the war was at its end, he was captured and sent into exile in 1899 in Guam, refusing to swear allegiance to American rule. Mabini returned to the Philippines after agreeing to swear allegiance and soon died of cholera in 1903. The fight for independence would continue under Manuel Quezon and his colleagues, who are featured in the 20 to 100 peso bills. Manuel Quezon and Sergio Osmeña were born the same year, 1878, but in vastly different circumstances. Quezon was born in the remote town of Baler, now Aurora, to a modest family. His father was a retired sergeant, and his mother was a schoolteacher. His early education was deeply rooted in Spanish religious teachings, but his ambitions led him to Manila, where he enrolled in Colegio de San Juan de Lecran and later the University of Santo Tomas to study law, where he then met Sergio Osmeña. In contrast to Quezon, Osmeña was born in Cebu to a wealthy Chinese mestizo businessman, but he was considered illegitimate and instead took his mother's surname. Despite this, he was accepted by the influential Osmeña clan, which helped establish his status in Cebu society. Osmeña pursued law at the University of Santo Tomas, where he became friends with Emilio Jacinto and subsequently with Quezon. Meanwhile, Manuel Rojas, a generation younger, was born in 1892 in Capiz. His life was marked by early tragedy, as his father was killed by the Spanish Guardia Civil before he was born. He was soon raised by his mother and maternal grandparents, who came from an influential haciendero family in the province, the Acuñas. While Rojas was still a child, both Quezon and Osmeña were caught in the middle of the Philippine Revolution. Osmeña initially opposed it, as he was still working the Spanish colonial government, only switching allegiance when Spain was clearly losing. He reputedly worked as a journalist and also a representative for the Cebuano revolutionaries, traveling with General Emilio Aguinaldo, whereas Quezon worked under General Tomas Mascardo and later engaged in guerrilla warfare against American troops. However, when it became evident that Aguinaldo's resistance was failing, both Osmeña and Quezon surrendered and took an oath of loyalty to the Americans and shifted from armed resistance to political advocacy for the freedom of the Philippines. Both men passed the bar exam in 1903, with Osmeña ranking second while Quezon ranked fourth. Meanwhile, Rojas was sent to a boarding school in Hong Kong, but soon returned to the Philippines and continued studies there due to homesickness. He excelled in law school at the University of the Philippines and graduating as valedictorian in 1913. He topped the bar exam that same year, setting the stage for the three men's rise in Philippine politics. Osmeña quickly became political allies with Quezon. He and Quezon founded the Nacionalista Party, advocating for greater Filipino autonomy from the United States. And at the young age of 29, he became the first Speaker of the Philippine Assembly in 1907. Quezon, meanwhile, was appointed resident commissioner to Washington, where he tirelessly lobbied for Philippine independence. By the 1920s, Quezon had solidified his power as Senate President, often clashing with American governor generals over policies that undermined Filipino interests. Osmeña, on the other hand, remained a steady force in the legislature, eventually leading to the Osrox Mission in 1933 with Manuel Rojas. This mission sought U.S. approval for the Hair House Cutting Act, which promised Philippine independence but with provisions allowing American military bases to remain and implementing tariffs and quotas on Filipino imports. Quezon opposed this, seeing it as an infringement on sovereignty, leading to a bitter political struggle between him and Osmeña. Eventually, the Tidings-McDuffie Act of 1934 replaced the earlier bill, aligning with Quezon's vision and setting a 10-year path to independence. Rojas, the youngest among the three, rose to prominence during this period. Elected as the Speaker of the House in 1922, he worked closely with both Quezon and Osmeña. Though initially supporting the Hair House Cutting Act, he later aligned with Quezon due to personal interests. Quezon was elected the first president of the Commonwealth in 1935, with Osmeña as his vice president. This period saw efforts to modernize the country, including social reforms, educational improvements, and championing a national language. One of Quezon's most significant cultural legacies was the promotion of Tagalog as the basis for a national language, which will soon become Filipino. His government also encouraged the migration of Visayans and Ilocano settlers in Mindanao, which greatly increased the population of the island. However, this unfortunately led to tensions between the Christians and the native Muslims in what is now the Bangsamoro region, which will soon culminate to the latter's struggle for independence and self-determination. All of this will be put on hold as the looming threat of World War II disrupted the Commonwealth's progress, as in 1941, Japan invaded the Philippines. Quezon and his government were forced into exile in the United States, while Osmeña remained as his second-in-command.
To come to the United States, I had to make a trip on the sea, under the water, and in the air. I started at long, perilous trip with Captain Barclay of New York, who defied several Japanese destroyers and took me through those waters safely to Mindanao.
Rojas, serving as a reserve officer, was involved in resistance efforts but was later captured by the Japanese. Controversially, he served in the puppet government of President Jose P. Laurel, though some believe he secretly aided the resistance. Quezon's health deteriorated during his exile, and he died in 1944 in the United States. With his passing, Osmeña assumed the presidency. He returned to the Philippines with General Douglas MacArthur during the Liberation Campaign in 1944-45. By the end of the war, Osmeña was formally reinstated as the head of the restored Commonwealth government, tasked with rebuilding a war-ravaged nation.
The Japanese ravage our towns and cause wanton destruction. We need food, medicine, and clothing. We need them now. That is why I'm here.
Despite Osmeña's role in post-war reconstruction, his leadership was soon challenged by his former ally, Manuel Rojas. The political landscape had shifted, with Rojas leading the liberal wing of the Nacionalistas against Osmeña's conservative wing in the 1946 elections. Rojas' liberals would later split from the party and form the backbone of the modern Liberal Party. Despite Osmeña's stature as a senior statesman, Rojas' campaign, backed by strong American support, won the election. On July 4, 1946, Rojas became the first president of the Independent Republic of the Philippines. His presidency focused on securing American economic aid and military assistance, culminating in the controversial Bell Trade Act, which allowed U.S. citizens preferential trading rights in the Philippines. Because of his unabashedly pro-American policies, he faced growing unrest from the Balahap insurgency in Central Luzon, which lasted throughout the late 40s and into the early 50s. His tenure, however, was cut short when he suffered a fatal heart attack in 1948. Osmeña, on the other hand, retired from politics after his electoral defeat, spending his remaining years in Cebu until his death in 1961, almost at the start of Diosdado Macapagal's presidency, who is featured in the 200 peso bill. Diosdado Macapagal was born on September 28, 1910 in Lubao, Pampanga. Despite coming from a noble line of ancient Tondo princes and being a direct descendant of Lacandula, his family raised pigs just to make ends meet, earning him the nickname the poor boy from Lubao. But from an early age, Macapagal excelled in his studies as he showed exceptional academic promise. Despite financial struggles, he graduated as a valedictorian in elementary and salutatorian in high school. He took his pre-law at the University of the Philippines, Manila, and later at the Philippine Law School. But it wasn't easy as he had to sustain himself by taking part-time jobs such as being an accountant, despite being on a scholarship. Suddenly, he had to drop out of law school due to financial difficulties and poor health. But with the help of Don Honorio Ventura and support from relatives in Pampanga, he returned from his studies, which eventually earned him a law degree from the University of Santo Tomas. In 1936, he topped up Philippine bar exams with an impressive 89.95%. He went on to pursue further studies, earning a Master's of Laws degree, a Doctor of Civil Law, and even a PhD in economics. His dedication to education and his humble background became a foundation of his later policies as a politician. Macapagal's sharp legal mind caught the attention of President Manuel Quezon, and soon he found himself working as a legal assistant in the Malacañang Palace. During World War II, he worked under President Jose P. Laurel's collaborationist government while secretly aiding the anti-Japanese guerrilla forces, much like Manuel Rojas before him. After the war, his career skyrocketed, first as a head of the DFA's legal division, then as a congressman of Pampanga, where he authored laws that improved the lives of the rural poor. His tenure in Congress was defined by an emphasis on social justice, creating policies for land reform, rural banking, and wage improvements. His performance earned him as one of the 10 outstanding congressmen by the Congressional Press Club. In the 1957 presidential elections, the Liberal Party nominated the former Chief Justice Jose Yulo as their candidate and soon convinced Diosdado Macapagal to be his vice presidential running mate. Yulo's opponent, Carlos Garcia, won as president, but in a sudden twist of fate, Macapagal won as vice president, being the first in the series of political traditions where the president and vice president are from different and often rival camps. Being part of the opposition, President Garcia shut him out of the cabinet, refusing to give him a role in government. But Macapagal used this to his advantage by touring all over the country, positioning himself as the honest alternative, while Garcia's administration benefited the local Filipino elite and his Filipino First policy and corruption plaguing his government. He continued to strengthen his network, building alliances that would help him secure the presidency, and his strategy worked. In the 1961 presidential elections, Macapagal won the presidency, defeating Garcia by a wide margin. He immediately set to work, implementing free market reforms, devaluing the peso to boost exports, pushing for land reform, and even changing the date of Philippine independence from July 4 to June 12, a move that cemented the country's identity separate from its American past. Macapagal also pursued an ambitious foreign policy. He proposed for the creation of Mafilindo, a confederation by Malaya, Philippines, and Indonesia, but the idea collapsed due to rising tensions, including the Philippines' claim over Sabah and Indonesia's confrontasi against Malaysia. The idea of Mafilindo later laid the groundwork in the formation of the regional bloc called the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, or ASEAN. His administration also struggled with corruption allegations, notably accepting bribes from the CIA and the infamous Harry Stonehill scandal. Macapagal's own Justice Secretary, Jose W. Jokno, wanted to prosecute Stonehill for tax evasion, economic sabotage, blackmail, and corruption of public officials. But Macapagal deported Stonehill instead and removed Jokno from office to cover any involvement in the case, as Stonehill owned a blue book that contained the names of government officials whom he bribed, including Macapagal. This decision backfired, damaging his credibility as a corruption fighter, which led him losing the 1965 presidential election against the new rising star, his former ally, Senate President Ferdinand Marcos. After his presidency, he soon led the Constitutional Convention of 1971. However, the process became mired in controversy, especially after Marcos declared martial law in 1972. Macapagal later rejected the legitimacy of the new constitution, criticizing Marcos' authoritarian grip on power.
If Mr. Marcos still clings to power, now if he persists in clinging to his position by force, then there is no other remedy for the people except to do everything that they can in order to restore democracy in this country.
He became part of the opposition that challenges Marcos' authoritarian rule. Despite no longer being in power, he remained a critical voice in the country's political discourse. Alongside Macapagal was a fierce political opponent of Marcos. His name was Senator Ninoy Aquino, who is featured in the 500 peso bill alongside with his wife, Cory. Benigno Aquino Jr., known as Ninoy, was born in 1932 to a politically prominent family in Tarlac. At just 17, he was already covering the Korean War as a journalist, and by 22, he became the youngest mayor in the country, and soon later, the youngest senator ever elected. But his biggest challenge came in the 1970s, when he became the most vocal critic of President Ferdinand Marcos. While Marcos tightened his grip on power, declaring martial law in 1972, Ninoy was arrested and sentenced for execution for alleged rebellion. After years in prison, he was allowed to go to the United States for medical treatment. From exile, he continued his fight for democracy.
That after my 8 years in prison, I have lost appetite for office. I am no longer seeking the presidency of this land. I'm not seeking anymore any office in this country. But believe me, I said, when I tell you that while I have vowed never to enter the political arena again, I shall dedicate the last drop of my blood to the restoration of freedom and the dismantlement of your martial law.
But when he decided to return to the Philippines, things took a tragic turn. On August 21, 1983, Ninoy Aquino stepped off the plane, ready to challenge Marcos once again. But within seconds, the assassination shocked the entire country, sparking mass protests and a wave of outrage. His funeral drew millions of supporters and critics of the dictatorship, and at the center of this political storm was his widow, Corazon Cory Aquino. She had always been in the background, playing the role of the supportive wife during Ninoy's political campaigns. But after her husband's assassination, people looked to her as a symbol of resistance.
I am glad that my husband tried to do everything he could for the good of the people. Excuse me. No, sometimes I can control myself.
She was reluctant at first, but as the opposition movement grew, so did her determination to face Marcos. Pressured by the United States, Marcos called for a snap election. Cory ran against him, backed by a massive grassroots movement and serving as a unifying candidate for various opposition factions. But the election was marred by fraud, with reports of ballot tampering and intimidation, leading to some election officials walking out in protest during the counting process. Soon, a group of military officials orchestrated a coup attempt, but the plan was leaked, leading to immediate arrests. In desperation, the rebel leaders sought help from Jaime Cardinal Sin, who used Radio Veritas to call for public support.
This is Cardinal Sin speaking. I am calling our people to support our two good friends. If any of you could be around to show your solidarity and your support in this very crucial period, I would be very happy if you could support them now. I would only wish that violence and bloodshed be avoided.
What followed became one of history's most remarkable non-violent uprisings, the People Power Revolution. millions of Filipinos gathered along EDSA Avenue, demanding Marcos to resign. As military defections increased and international pressure intensified, the regime's grip weakened. Finally, after 5 days of protests, Marcos and his family fled to Hawaii, and Cory Aquino officially became the first female president of the Philippines. Macapagal returned as an elder statesman, offering advice to the new democratic government. Cory faced enormous challenges as president. She had to rebuild a nation ravaged by the dictatorship. She restored democracy, drafted a new constitution, and worked to stabilize the economy wrought by mismanagement by the Marcos regime. But her presidency was without controversy. Coups, economic struggles, and land reform issues tested her leadership. After her term ended in 1992, her administration left a mixed legacy for both supporters and critics. Macapagal, meanwhile, eventually passed away in 1997 due to health complications. Cory Aquino, in her elder years, was diagnosed with cancer and died in 2009 during the term of President Gloria Macapagal Arroyo, who was the daughter of the late President Macapagal. The legacies of Ninoy and Cory remains debated. To some, they are seen as symbols of democracy and sacrifice, who represented the idea that political change can happen without the need for a violent revolution or uprising. But to others, Ninoy was seen as an opportunist politician who will do whatever it takes to gain power, whereas Cory was seen as an ineffective leader who, apart from leaving many unresolved issues after her presidency, also let the Marcoses go back to the Philippines, where Ferdinand Marcos' son, Bongbong, eventually became president in 2022. During his administration, the polymer banknote series was introduced, following its trial run under the previous Duterte administration, where they replaced the historical figures Jose Abad Santos, Vicente Lim, and Jose Pallañez Escoda on the 1,000 peso bills. Jose Abad Santos was born on February 19, 1886 in San Fernando, Pampanga, and was the seventh of 10 children in the family. Called Seng Seng by his family, the 10-year-old Jose, along with his older brother Pedro, joined the Katipunan to seek justice for the death of their father, who had been tortured and beaten by the Spanish authorities. As a young recruit, Seng Seng served as a courier, clandestinely delivering messages for the Katipuneros. Before long, Pedro was arrested and imprisoned, but with the help of influential friends and family, he was soon released. Witnessing his brother's arrest left a lasting impression on Jose, inspiring him to dedicate his life in defending the helpless and the powerless. At the end of the Philippine Revolution and the subsequent Philippine-American War, Jose resumed with his studies, initially learning from American soldier teachers. As a result, he became part of the first generation of Filipinos educated under them, with the passage of the Pensionado Act, which provided Filipinos the opportunity to study in the United States. Jose was selected as part of this privileged group of pensionados that will soon take advantage of this once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. He attended various schools and universities such as Santa Clara High School in California, Northwestern University in Illinois, where he earned his Bachelor of Law, and George Washington University for his master's degree in law in 1909. By 1911, he was admitted to the Philippine Bar and began his legal career as an assistant attorney at the Bureau of Justice. Beyond public office, Jose was the first Filipino corporate lawyer for institutions like the Philippine National Bank and the Manila Railroad Company, now PNR. He served as Undersecretary of Justice and by 1922 was appointed Secretary of Justice. Jose's judicial capabilities led to his appointment as an Associate Justice of the Supreme Court in 1932 and eventually as Chief Justice in 1941. General Vicente Lim, on the other hand, was born on April 5, 1888 in Calamba, Laguna. Like Jose Abad Santos before him, he also joined the Katipunan at the young age of 14, acting as courier for General Miguel Malvar's forces in the Calamba area. At the end of the conflict, he continued in his studies, graduating from Philippine Normal School, now Philippine Normal University, and briefly became a teacher. But Lim wasn't destined to stay in the classroom, but rather on the battlefield. In 1910, He was accepted into the United States military at West Point, one of the first Filipinos to enter the prestigious military institution. It was a grueling experience, as Lim was subjected to immense pressure, not just academically and physically, but also culturally, as reflected by the nickname Cannibal given to him by his West Point classmates. This derogatory name stemmed from the stereotype that Filipinos were savages in need of civilization. But Lim soon wore that nickname as a badge of honor, much like Rizal and his contemporaries did with the term Indio with his organization Los Indios Bravos. As one of the first Filipinos who graduated at West Point in 1914, Lim was commissioned as a second lieutenant and joined the Philippine Scouts, a Filipino unit under American command. Lim was stationed at Fort San Pedro in Iloilo, but all was not well as he faced discrimination from his American superiors. Lim wasn't afraid to speak up against the unfair treatment of Filipinos in the military. In fact, he reported his commanding officer for misconduct, an act that got the American officer removed from his post. In 1916, he transferred to the Philippine Constabulary, the country's militarized police force. He had hoped to lead the organization, but despite his qualifications, his appointment was blocked by the U.S. War Department due to his temper and was considered difficult to work with. Determined to elevate his military career, Lim pursued further education in various military schools in the U.S., such as in Fort Benning, Fort Leavenworth, and the U.S. Army War College. By the 1930s, the Philippines was preparing for independence, and Lim aimed to become the chief of staff of the newly formed Philippine Army. But Douglas MacArthur, serving as military advisor to President Manuel Quezon, favored Paulino Santos and Basilio Valdez over him, and despite his qualifications, Lim became deputy chief of staff instead. Apart from his military duties, Lim was also one of the co-founders of the Boy Scouts of the Philippines, and he also supported his wife, Pilar Hidalgo Lim, and her colleague, Josefa Llanes Escoda, in establishing the Girl Scouts of the Philippines. Josefa Llanes Escoda was born on September 20, 1898, in Dingras, Ilocos Norte. In 1922, with a scholarship from the American Red Cross, she traveled to the United States, and by 1925, she had earned a master's degree in social work from Columbia University. Apart from academics, she was also politically active, particularly in the fight for the women's right to vote. In 1921, she co-founded the National Federation of Women's Clubs, or NFWC, advocating for women's suffrage in the Philippines. This was a time when women had little voice in politics. Fast forward to 1937, after years of grassroots campaigning, Filipino women finally won the right to vote. Everything changed when the Japanese invaded the Philippines. As President Manuel Quezon and his cabinet was about to leave the country to form a government in exile in the United States, Jose Abad Santos, however, chose to stay behind. In recognition of his service, he was appointed acting president and commander-in-chief of what remains of the Philippine Commonwealth before going into hiding. Meanwhile, Lim, now a brigadier general, commands the 41st Division of the Philippine Army, which was initially tasked in defending Tagaytay, but then redeployed in defending the Abukay line in Bataan. But despite their efforts, they were eventually overwhelmed. The Americans and Filipinos surrendered on April 1942, and Lim was sent to Camp O'Donnell. Jose Abad Santos, meanwhile, was soon captured by Japanese forces while traveling in Cebu with his son Pepito, alongside 3 military personnel. They were taken and transferred to numerous locations where the Japanese demanded his cooperation. He stubbornly refused, for renouncing his oath of allegiance to the United States and to his country would be tantamount to being a traitor. His captor, General Kawaguchi Kiyotake, placed him on a ship. At first, Abad Santos believed he was being transported to Manila, but instead, they landed in Cotabato, where he was held in Lanao del Sur. It was there that he received the news that all Filipino leaders who won't cooperate with the Japanese will be liquidated, and that included Jose. General Kawaguchi implored him to cooperate with the Japanese, but he remained true to his allegiance. Before his execution, Abad Santos turned to his son and said, "Do not cry, Pepito. Show these people that you are brave. It is a rare opportunity for me to die for our country. Not everyone is given that chance." When Abad Santos' case was reopened in 1949, Kawaguchi pleaded guilty, for he felt regret in taking his life. General Lim, meanwhile, was released by the Japanese soon after as a gesture of goodwill to Filipinos in liberating them from the Americans. But he started planning to organize a resistance movement throughout the Philippines in his own room at the Philippine General Hospital's Cancer Institute. Josefa, under the guise of social work, smuggled food, medicine, and messages to prisoners of war. The NFWC building in Malate became a lifeline. Even as the Japanese watched, she and her fellow colleagues operated in the shadows. She used her connections with the Red Cross and scouting organizations to aid prisoners. Alongside her husband and Vicente Lim's compatriot, Antonio Escoda, risked everything to help the resistance. Lim and Antonio tried to escape to Australia to continue the fight against the Japanese, but was soon captured and was detained at Fort Santiago in Intramuros, back then a notorious site of torture and executions. Josefa too was taken 2 months later, where she was last seen on January 6, 1945. Vicente Lim and Josefa Llanes Escoda were never seen again. Although one eyewitness said that Lim, Antonio, and his other compatriots were probably beheaded at the Manila North Cemetery. The remains were never identified, and the exact date of their deaths remains unknown. With the polymer series now in circulation, the prospect of reinstating some of the historical figures in the new banknotes remains uncertain, as political realities often influence decisions on who should be featured on the nation's currency. Whether they will return or not, there is no denying that these figures dedicated their lives in serving the Filipino nation, and it's up to the collective will of Filipinos to elevate their legacies, whether the good or the bad, for generations to come. If you enjoyed this video and want to support the channel, don't forget to like, subscribe, and click the bell icon to stay updated. You can also support the channel on Patreon or donate via GCash or Coffee, as it helps the channel in creating more educational content like this. And with that out of the way, thank you very much for watching, have a good day, and I'll see you in the next one.